From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump puts a quick pause on federal grants and loans to have his administration review their terms, sparking claims of executive overreach and a stay by a federal judge before the White House reverses course and removes the pause 2 days later. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Bill McGurn. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, might be the most important agency that is the least well-known among the general public. But OMB is expected to be at the center of the action during the second Trump administration, and so it is this week. On Monday, the acting head of OMB issued a 2-page memo with an order to federal agencies to pause grant and loan programs. It says career and political appointees in the executive branch have a duty to align federal spending and action with the will of the American people as expressed through presidential priorities. It directed that this temporary pause was to take effect at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, so not a whole lot of notice there. Now here we sit here on Wednesday, and the White House has removed that pause. We'll get into that a bit later, but let's start with a few clips of the response. This is Chuck Schumer today, his take on this budget freeze.
In one instant, in the blink of an eye, in the dark of night, Donald Trump committed one of the cruelest actions that I have seen the federal government do in a very long time. Shutting off billions, maybe trillions of dollars of things that average American families need. Everything was on the line. Our police officers who keep us safe, our firefighters who keep us safe, hospitals, particularly rural hospitals that need their funding to help sick people. Our cities, our schools, from one end of the country to the other, you cut off school funding, property taxes go up. People hate property taxes.
Here was White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt on Tuesday tangling with the press.
The executive order that the president signed. There's also a freeze on hiring, as you know, a regulatory freeze, and there's also a freeze on foreign aid. And this is, again, incredibly important to ensure that this administration is taking into consideration how hard the American people are working. And their tax dollars actually matter to this administration. You know, just during this pause, DOJ and OMB have actually found that there was $37 million that was about to go out the door to the World Health Organization, which is an organization, as you all know, that President Trump, with the swipe of his pen in that executive order, is no longer wants the United States to be a part of. So that wouldn't be in line with the president's agenda.
Now on Wednesday, this is the statement from the White House press secretary after a court ruling putting this federal pause on hold until Monday. It says, in light of the injunction, OMB has rescinded the memo to end any confusion on federal policy created by the court ruling and the dishonest media coverage. The executive orders issued by the president on funding reviews remain in full force and effect and will be rigorously implemented by all agencies and departments, unquote. So, Alicia, I guess my read of that is that the incoming new administration is still going to look at the funding that is going out the door of these federal agencies. It's just going to do so without any sort of immediate pause, in effect, halting them while that review takes place.
Right. So it seems like they're essentially maintaining the same policy while it's kind of walking it back, in part because the court enjoined it, at least temporarily, and given it's D.C. court, it likely would have been upheld by the D.C. circuit anyway. So they're essentially going to do what they were planning to do anyways and calm the uproar. So just to clarify, the original memo had directed agencies to put a hold on grants that haven't been dispersed, so that the Trump appointees can review them to, quote unquote, determine the best uses of the funds consistent with the law and the president's priorities. And then they were supposed to get back to OMB with detailed information on any programs, projects, or activities that don't comply with his executive orders. This pause didn't affect, at least if you read it strictly based on the letter that is consistent with the law, did not affect entitlement programs and the vast majority of federal spending. It really only affected some, competitive grant programs, or what we'd call competitive grant programs, for instance, under the IRA, infrastructure bill, in which companies or states compete for awards based on executive discretionary reviews. And again, this made up a very small fraction of total spending, but there was a lot of hullabaloo because it wasn't necessarily clear from the memo that that's what the president was referring to. And so states actually, when they sued, they claimed, a parade of horribles, you're going to cut off the Medicaid spending, all of that. Well, no, the OMB actually clarified it in a follow-up memo on Tuesday that not only financial assistance to individuals was exempt, but almost all entitlement programs were as well. And so I think the uproar was a little overwrought. But it seems that Trump, I wouldn't say he surrendered. I think they're going to still do what they intended to do, while at least, conceding to the courts that, okay, we have to comply with your order regardless, but we're still going to do what we're going to do.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In some sense, though, the White House may have brought some of this on themselves in the way that they rolled this out in a unclear kind of memorandum with the pause to take effect within 24 hours. And then, as Alicia describes, having to go back and clarify after the fact which programs were not affected, leading to all sorts of questions and confusion. Bill, if you are putting a pause on federal money and it's not clear at the outset whether it affects an enormous program like Medicaid, you're asking for a lot of hard questions and a lot of confusion out there in the country.
That's right, Kyle. I think the original memo was not clear. It enabled them to make all sorts of headlines, bring court cases, and so forth. A lot of it is exaggerated. To Chuck Schumer, anytime he cuts spending, we're becoming like East Berlin. I think what amazed me about this is kind of realizing how dependent so much of America is on federal spending, from the states and everything. If Chuck Schumer's right, I think that's alarming. In the end, I don't think it will necessarily hurt Donald Trump. As Alicia pointed out, what they did was basically eliminate the freeze, and they're going ahead with case-by-case examination of federal spending. They want their people to look at things. It's only an analysis of discretionary spending. The entitlements aren't there. And I think it may have brought home the political lesson I think that most Americans would take. Here's the president trying to make good in his promise to cut federal spending. And what happens? The blob fights back. Even though he lost, I'm not sure it's such a big thing. The program's going to continue.
Alicia, what about the legal merits of this case? Again, I think the lack of clarity in this initial memo may be added to the confusion on the law here, because if we can break down spending into some broad buckets, there's money that Congress appropriates and says the president is supposed to send this to a specific project with a specific contractor, perhaps, and the president doesn't have much discretion about that. And I don't think that this OMB memo was intended to try to dispute that or to do any sort of impoundment, as the phrase is. That would be when the president is looking at some money that Congress appropriated and saying, I'm going to refuse to spend that. That is not, I think, what this OMB memo was aimed at. But there's a second group of funding where Congress creates a broad loan program or some kind of discretionary grant program and says the executive, within some broad terms, can choose to use this money to accelerate broadband, let's say, or to help green energy, or to pick your pet project of somebody in Congress. And then after that, the president often adds his own strings to this kind of stuff and says the Energy Department or another federal agency says, we're going to prefer grant applications from people who are going into disadvantaged communities, or we're going to prefer grant applications from people who are providing childcare on site. There's all sorts of strings on federal money that the executive branch often adds. And I think the point here, Alicia, was that a new president with different priorities than the old president was coming in and saying, I'm going to take a look at those strings, those executive added strings. And if they don't fit my priorities, we're going to put the pause on that money until we can get those strings off.
I think that's right. And just largely, there is a lot of discretion in many of these programs. For example, you mentioned broadband program. The infrastructure law appropriated about $42 billion for broadband to go to the states for these, quote unquote, disadvantaged or underserved communities. agencies. And recall that the Biden administration was actually very slow in rolling this money out, as we wrote in an editorial, and almost none of that has been spent. I guess you could argue, based on the state's own argument, that, well, this is actually the fact that they haven't spent all that money and it's been 4 or 5 years, that's also unconstitutional. No, it's not. There is a lot of discretion on when and how you spend some of these grants. And for example, in that broadband grants, they put all kinds of diversity and equity and inclusion metrics and requirements on that program. Now, this is an opportunity for the Trump administration to roll that back and also to allow other, not just fiber to qualify, but also potentially Elon Musk's Starlink. And that was a bone of contention between Republicans and the Biden administration. But there are a lot of these examples in which now the Trump administration will have an opportunity to essentially remove the conditions that the Biden administration imposed to promote its own progressive obsessions or agenda, and essentially perhaps impose its own, restrict the funds, say you can't use this to do that. I mean, again, like the Biden administration did that with a number of the CHIPS awards. They said, well, you can't use any of this to pay dividends, which I guess may be common sense. But this is an opportunity for the Trump administration to put its own stamp on the spending. Now, there will also be an opportunity to potentially outline ideas and say, well, we actually don't need to spend as much as Congress provided. And that could be subject to the Impoundment Act. So the Trump administration may end up, when they're reviewing all this grant money, saying, well, that $400 billion loan program that the IRA provided for clean energy, that's too much. And we're going to recommend that Congress actually, scale that back or eliminate it entirely. And if they were to do that, that could become a subject of the Impoundment Act if Congress doesn't act upon the Trump administration's request. But I don't think the Impoundment Act is actually implicated or was implicated by this pause. In fact, the state attorneys generals don't really actually cite it. They claim that the Trump administration is somehow overriding Congress, its appropriations power, by not doling out money again. And maybe some of this was clarified by the second memo that said, well, no, entitlements aren't affected by any of this, and neither are formula grants. They also claim that the memo violated the Administrative Procedure Act, but that's not true. The Administrative Procedure Act really applies to final regulatory actions or agency actions. This is really just directing agencies to take a certain action, but it's not a final action in itself, which is, again, I'm even skeptical of whether a court can enjoin the memo, or a court would have to enjoin all the agencies from taking certain actions.
Bill, I would second your point on one lesson from this being how much state and local programs rely on money from Uncle Sam. I think that is surprising to people. Chuck Schumer mentioned rural hospitals at the beginning. Another one that you've heard in this debate recently is Meals on Wheels. It turns out a lot of the things that are happening locally apparently are getting money from Uncle Sam. A second broader point I think that is worth making is that if Congress, if Chuck Schumer doesn't like this situation where one person in charge of the executive branch is putting one set of strings on federal money, and the next person in charge of the executive branch is putting a different set of strings on federal money, then Congress could get up off its tush and start doing its job of actually writing the laws and sending the money where Congress thinks it ought to go. I mean, every time Congress passes any kind of big bill, you can go through there and count the number of times that it says the secretary shall do this and the secretary may do that. And what you get as a result is executive government. When Congress passes these kinds of grant and loan programs and says, we're going to appropriate, $50 billion and let the Energy Department figure out how to spend it, what you end up happening is a change in the White House, a change in administrations, a change in views about the best uses of that money, Bill.
Yeah, I think your larger point is that we're all better off when we adhere to the congressional distinctions. I mean, the president is the chief executive in charge of the executive branch and the employees, and Congress is in charge of the nation's purse strings. And when they want something spent on X, they can say it. In fact, they have to say it if they want it. So what we're here talking about is rather a small subset of Biden priorities that he say added to a bill when it came. I think we're going to prefer this or that. And it's absolutely insane to say one president can bind another to his discretionary choices. It's just crazy. And I think, again, the American public is going to see this. They don't know about the Impoundment Act and so forth, but they will see why it's so hard to cut federal spending.